And we are live.
Shall I go now, Blaine?
You're good to go.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Bob. I'm the co-chair of the DC Police Reform Commission. Before we start the press conference, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege relating to the most recent shootings and homicide in the District of Columbia over yesterday and the last several weeks. You know, for me, these types of killings and shootings are very, very personal, particularly when you've had family members who have been shot and murdered in communities where they reside. And so I just wanted to make that comment because the work of this commission is very, very personal. Over the last 7 months, our commission have met 4 nights a week, including some additional side meetings of individual members of the commission. We've issued a report of 500 plus pages, but it's not the pages and the number of pages in the report that we've issued. It's the recommendations. It's the 90 plus recommendations. And I might add that this report is not a term paper from a university or a college. It is not theoretical. It is practical with recommendations that can be implemented. And some of these recommendations can be implemented immediately, and some of the recommendations can and should be implemented over a period of time. I might also add that 20 members of our commission from every profession within the district were represented on our commission. And those individuals brought not only their compassion and their concern for our district, but also their professionalism and their real-life experiences that help to inform the work of the commission. And some of the most impactful presentations before our commission did not come from university or other professionals, but some of the most impactful recommendations and presentations before our commission came from young individuals, students who have been mostly impacted in terms of their relationship with the Metropolitan Police Department and policing in general. So we're going to take a few moments to move forward with the themes of the report, some of the recommendations within our report. And so at this point, I'd like to introduce the co-chair of the Police Commission's report, Dr. Christy Lopez. And then in my final comment is that we don't expect these recommendations to be implemented overnight. But I do want to repeat that we will be involved over the next 30 days and beyond in our meetings with members of the City Council, meeting with members of the administration and members of the community, because we believe passionately that our recommendations should be considered seriously and implemented, some immediately, but over a period of time. And we've recommended a process for that to happen. Professor Lopez.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bob, and thank all of you for being here today and for your attention to this really, really important issue. The council asked us to make recommendations for how to revision policing and public safety in the district, and that's what we did. Broadly speaking, our recommendations to re-envision public safety fall into 3 categories. First, we do so by strengthening the safety net to keep people from falling into crisis. Second, by taking a multifaceted approach to public safety and violence prevention that involves more than just a police response. And third, by making changes directly to MPD so that it is more effective and accountable and has a culture of transparency and of guardianship. So our report breaks these down into about 90 different recommendations, as Commissioner Bob said. I'm going to go into these three areas very briefly before turning it over to Commissioner Davis. So first, strengthening the safety net. The best way we know to promote public safety is to invest in communities so that people thrive and do not fall into crisis in the first place. So we have recommendations for where and how the district can do this. Some involve investing more in programs that already exist, like the district's programs for providing pathways to safe and permanent housing, programs for improving community care and treatment for substance abuse and addiction. Some of our recommendations require more dramatic change, like the changes we recommend in schools to make them safer and more conducive to learning and growth, which Commissioner Davis will talk more about in a moment. Second, many of our recommendations go towards bringing in a broader set of first responders and violence preventers. Police have been telling us for decades that they've been doing too much and that a lot of what they're doing would be better done by others. We agree. We have many recommendations designed to give people more options than just a police response when they need help. Again, in part, this simply means truly investing in systems that already exist. For example, we recommend assessing whether the Department of Behavioral Health, CRT, crime reduction teams, and the CHAMPS program can provide, crisis response teams is the CRT here, and CHAMPS program can provide sufficient 24/7 crisis response. And if they cannot, bringing in community-based groups who can. Similarly, we recommend that the council finally create the co-responder police mental health teams that are required by the NEAR Act. And we also recommend a complete re-engineering of the Office of Unified Command so that 911 can deploy a more diverse array of emergency responders in recognition of the fact that most 911 calls don't require a police response and wouldn't need a police response if we had more fitting responders available. And Commissioner Goldston will speak about these and other recommendations in a moment. Similarly, we spent a lot of time considering the challenge of gun violence. As Commissioner Bob's opening remarks indicated, this concern permeated every conversation that we had. We learned that research shows us that every successful anti-violence strategy has one thing in common: face-to-face interaction with potential perpetrators of violence by people who are not police. DC has 2 violence interruption programs that take this approach. And so far, they appear to be as or more beneficial than traditional policing strategies. We recommend scaling up those programs, as well as better coordinating them and studying their impact so that the district can be more effective at preventing gun violence and the broad generational trauma that such violence causes. We're glad to see that the Mayor's Building Blocks program also takes this approach. Third, making MPD more accountable and effective and ensuring a culture of transparency and guardianship. In order to end this dynamic where many communities feel simultaneously over-policed and underprotected in the district, in addition to decentering policing as we've described above, we make a number of recommendations to change how MPD polices, which Commissioner Sultan will speak to more in just a moment. We also make recommendations designed to create a culture of transparency within MPD. We found that the lack of such a culture means that MPD is sometimes reflexively resistant to providing information that the public clearly should have. And sometimes they have not even gathered and analyzed the information themselves, which leads to another problem that we found, that many of MPD's policing strategies and tactics are not evidence informed. That's why we recommend, for example, a moratorium on MPD's crime suppression teams and gun recovery unit until MPD collects and analyzes and shares the information about how they operate, what they do, so that the public and MPD know whether they're actually beneficial and effective at reducing crime and violence. We recommend that instead of relying on de facto jump out squads or stop and frisk, that MPD move to a strategy of person-based focused deterrence, which has been shown to be more effective at preventing violent crime. Finally, we recommend a series of changes to external oversight of MPD to improve both front end, before misconduct happens, and back end, after misconduct happens, accountability. The key piece of these 2 new oversight, of this variety of oversight structures, is the creation of a deputy auditor for public safety within the office of the DC auditor. That's just a glimpse of what our report recommends. We're happy to answer any questions in just a moment. And for the moment, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Davis, who will talk more about police in schools and policing youth.
Thank you, Commissioner Lopez. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Samantha Davis. I use she, they pronouns, and I have had the opportunity to serve as one of the co-chairs of a committee that explored policing of youth and police in schools. I'll be just taking a few moments to dive deeper into some of those recommendations and explain our grounding in that. I want to first express gratitude to the Black youth, the youth of color, the parents, educators, and organizers who have been organizing on these issues for years and whose voices and expertise have allowed this commission to think critically about the ways in which our reliance on police cause harm and the urgent need to invest in the social and emotional well-being of young people. So throughout the report, particularly when we're talking about young people, there are a few themes that rose. So one is we believe that schools should be sanctuaries for young people, that young people should be supported and cared for in those education environments as well as in those communities. We believe that young people go to schools to learn, and therefore they should have environments where they are not operating with fear or have threat of being harmed. And so recommendations in our report include removing police from schools and increasing investments to youth safety through community-led non-police supports. It also includes items such as prohibiting MPD from making arrests on school grounds. Another theme in this report is honoring young people as young people. And so we reviewed the various practices of MPD and other agencies when it comes to young people, and wanted to ensure that we were taking an approach to public safety that truly addressed the needs of young folk. Recommendations include things among decriminalizing status offenses, in some cases prohibiting police involvement altogether. It includes mature Miranda rights and ensuring that young people are clear on what their rights are when dealing with law enforcement, and addressing the coercive nature of consent searches. And then the third and maybe most important theme is that we need to invest. We need to invest radically within our young people and in our communities, and ensure that we're taking an approach that is rooted in public health, that is looking at the social and emotional well-being of our young people. And to do that, to rely on young people, to rely on families, on youth advocates, to ensure that our approach is one that does reduce the footprint of police in our communities, that eliminates police presence in our schools, and that provides a comprehensive approach, and again, to ensure that young people are safe and that they can thrive. I'll just quickly share that these recommendations are grounded in a number of findings that we discovered throughout this process. That includes that when it comes to young people especially, we found that we rely more on police to address normal childhood or adolescent behavior or responses to trauma instead of care-based professionals and resources that have the expertise to appropriately meet their needs. That when police are in schools, the most marginalized students are more likely to experience harm, violence, or be arrested. That's Black students, that's immigrant students, disabled students, queer students, students dealing with housing instability, and so on and so forth. And then also knowing that true public safety, as Commissioner Lopez mentioned, comes from investing in people. It comes from investing in our young people and to ensure that our basic necessities are met and that we have the resources within our communities to keep each other safe. Lastly, I'll just share that we also know that the time for this change is now, especially given the past year with the pandemic and the racial injustice. Research shows that even the viral videos of police killing Black people is traumatic, especially for young people. The exposure to such videos, the exposure to such over policing in our communities is detrimental to the mental health of Black youth, especially Black girls, resulting in increased levels of anxiety, depression symptoms, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so again, our hope is to reduce the footprint of police in our communities, eliminate them in schools, and to overall invest and ensure that young people are supported, that they are loved and treated in dignity and respect. Happy to answer any questions about that. And with that, I will pass it to Commissioner Goldston.
Commissioner Davis, before it's passed on, I just wanted to make one comment, and that is not just the police not making arrests on school campus, but we're also saying that the immigration service should not make arrests on school campus. Wanted to make that point.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bob, and thank you, Commissioner Davis and Commissioner Lopez. Thanks to each of you all of you for your hard work and for all who are joining us this afternoon. My name is Pastor Delante Goldston. I pastor Peace Fellowship Church and live and pastor in Ward 7 and help to lead Peace Walks DC. My role in the commission was to co-chair committee around police accountability and to participate on a committee that focused on building up non-police alternatives to public safety. And as a faith leader in our community, it is not lost on me that we are presenting this report during Holy Week. And one of the things that I as a pastor think about when I think about Jesus walking into the city of Jerusalem, Jesus said in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 and 42, Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem because the city would not do what was needed to make for peace. Jesus only cried twice in the Bible, once over Lazarus and the second over the city, because the city would not do what was needed to make for peace. And one of the lessons that draws out for me as a commissioner and the work that we've done together is that peace is not made from the barrel of a gun. That peace is not made from the roaring of sirens. Peace is not made through more police presence in our communities, but that peace actually comes from the community. Peace comes from households, from neighborhoods, from community. Peace is made in community. And as we look at our city, 4 years ago, we implemented the NEAR Act. And though that law was passed, it has not been fully implemented. And as we've listened we've held countless forums and listening to residents, listening to survivors of gun violence, listening to survivors of police violence, listening to moms, listening to activists and organizers and ANC commissioners, it's become very clear that the solutions to public safety actually rest and reside in our communities. And so when we look at what that means practically, we're very grateful that the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement and the Cure Violence programs have gradually become more scaled up, but we obviously, it is obvious to us that when those programs began, that they began with a paltry budget, a tiny fraction of the $580 million that the police budget currently has. And so we're grateful to see that the mayor has begun to scale up investments in the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement and in the Cure Violence program. And we're certainly grateful that Director Linda Harley Harper has been appointed as the new Gun Violence Prevention Director over the Building Blocks Initiative that Dr. Roger Mitchell established. But what we want to emphasize is that these initiatives need to be boldly scaled up, that community-based, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led community organizations need to take the lead in really loving on our own communities and connecting our own communities to essential services. And so we definitely want to see an increased involvement of community competent and culturally competent mental health providers, community competent and culturally competent social service providers in our communities, and see a bold decentering of police officers, specifically in the areas of mental health crises and dealing with our unhoused loved ones in the city. And that comes from deep listening, not only to the community, but also deep listening to our officers, in listening to our commanders and listening to beat and front and beat officers. It's very clear that our officers are telling us that they cannot be and do not want to be therapists, cannot be and do not want to be social workers, cannot be and do not want to be first responders in some of the most critical community incidents in our community, but it is members of our community that really can effectively serve those roles. And so we want to see investments in community-based and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led initiatives to do prevention and intervention so that communities can own our own solutions to peacemaking. As Commissioner Bob said, we continue to mourn the loss of life that we just had in our Congress Park and Congress Heights community this past week, and also in the Woodland community this past week. But these are the communities that where leaders of the faith community, leaders from the community are already on the ground doing effective work of intervention and prevention. And that work just simply needs to be invested in. That work just simply needs to be believed in and seen as a critical and key part of the solution of dealing with state and gun violence. And so I'll just wrap by saying that these initiatives and this approach is not only based on listening to the community and based on listening to officers, but it's also based on research. It's based on evidence-based research that we've seen work, not only in our city, but also in cities across the country. We've looked at effective models here in the district. We've looked at effective models in Boston, effective models in Oakland, and we know what works and believe that our community can tweak and refine best practices that we've seen around the city and implement them in effective ways here in our city. I'm happy to address any additional questions on that. And I'll pass the mic to my sister, Commissioner Patrice Sultan.
Thank you, Commissioner Goldston, and good afternoon to everyone who's here. First, I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone who influenced our work, directly and indirectly. Whether you supported us, challenged us, or educated us about the state of policing in DC at our meetings or through your own channels, we heard you loud and clear. The first 4 sections of the report focus on what we need to do and where we need to invest to prevent crime, particularly violent crime throughout the city. And there's a lot there. But police violence is also violence. And the last 4 sections of the report focus on what we need to do about that. Section 5 calls for dramatic changes to how we allow police to operate in our city. There are 30 recommendations there. Some recommendations draw on practices other cities have used with great success for a long time, requiring officers to issue a citation instead of making an arrest under certain circumstances, decriminalizing low-level offenses like vending and panhandling. Some recommendations are consistent with what we've seen other cities do since George Floyd was murdered. For example, moving some of the responsibility for traffic enforcement from the police department to the Department of Transportation, banning no-knock warrants, ending qualified immunity. Some recommendations address problems that are unique to DC. For instance, other jurisdictions don't have thousands of special police officers in public housing, generating complaints of excessive force and harassment with very little training and virtually no oversight. and several recommendations offer an opportunity for DC to lead the way for other jurisdictions to follow. Disallowing search warrants of people's homes for low-level offenses and drug activity alone, eliminating consent searches, requiring better evidence than someone being in a high crime neighborhood or looking nervous around police in order to stop them. And as Commissioner Lopez noted earlier, placing a moratorium on the gun recovery unit and crime suppression teams unless and until the department can prove that they're not doing more harm than good. We did not reach these conclusions lightly, and it would be a huge mistake to suggest that we're recommending stripping the department of the tools it needs to combat serious crime. There is an important difference between feeling safe and being safe. The fact is that some of the aggressive tactics being used to hunt drugs and guns are making us less safe. Some of these tactics are inflicting trauma and thereby causing more crime. 63,000 documented stops in a 5-month period is an awful lot of stops, and very little attention is being paid to the outcomes of each of these encounters. There is shockingly little analysis happening inside the department, and there is shockingly little transparency about what the department is doing and why. So we are asking for a harm reduction approach to policing, de-escalation, focused deterrence, critical thinking. Far too often, when we inquired about why the department does things a certain way, the answer was that the law allows them to do that. There's such an emphasis on what is legal and what is justified, and very little emphasis on what is necessary and what is demonstrably effective. We asked questions like, is it needed? Is it worth it? And is it right? These changes in Section 5 are just as urgent as the other recommendations in the report, and it is everyone's responsibility, not just the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety, to make them happen. Every committee and every ward has a role to play. There are many steps the chief can take without the council requiring him to do so. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, for the opportunity to serve on the commission. I look forward to getting this done with your support, and I'll turn it over to you to share a few words.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, each of the commissioners who's here and those who aren't here for your service. I'm going to begin by making 3 points. The first is that the role of police in our society is something that we view as necessary and of value. At the same time, if you think about it, police and the police power is, when you put it up against our democratic principles, alarming, because one individual officer can deprive an individual citizen of their liberty and even take their life. And so what we need is an examination of the proper balance. What we have seen as we look across our country, but also in our city, is that we have expanded the role of police to the point that we can say that there's over-policing in America. So we look to a police officer to stop the bank robber, but we also look to the police officer to issue a parking ticket or to direct traffic. It is necessary that we have police, but it is also necessary that we take a critical look at this service and find the right balance. The council adopted or directed that I appoint a commission, police reform commission, last summer. And when I made the appointments, and again, thank you to each of you who served probably far, far, far more than you expected you would, I looked to identify individuals who had together represented a broad range of experience and perspective with regard to law enforcement and criminal justice in our community. I also looked to folks who were representative of our community with this goal, and that is that because of the importance of policing, as well as the power of policing that can so easily be abused, that we really should be looking to recommendations, how we find the right balance and how we improve policing from the standpoint of what the community wants, what we ourselves, the citizens, that is you representing us to the Police Reform Commission, think would be the best way, not only in terms of justice, but also in terms of effectiveness. I would characterize, for those who are going to look at the report as it's now come out, I would characterize the recommendations as, for some, a bit edgy, but necessary, something that we really need to look at seriously. Because we need to accept, and I think it's become clear to us, that there is a greater reliance on police than is necessary, and a more acceptance of some of the abuses by police than we should accept. And when I say we, I speak very broadly, not just Washington, D.C., but across the country. And so it can be a little bit jarring, but we should, every one of us, look seriously at these recommendations. Because in the end, the goal is, how do we protect the community, both in terms of safety, but in terms of liberty? And how do we ensure more effective policing? And that clearly was what was in the eyes of each of the members of the commission as they spent their time with this. I do want to note, because I have jurisdiction over schools and education, that we have already scheduled a hearing. I believe it's April 21st on school security. It's not going to be looking solely at the recommendations of the commission, the recommendations that have just come out. We also will be looking at the fact that beginning last summer, the council directed that school security be transitioned from MPD to DCPS. So we will be having a hearing on this issue on April 21st. And I will work with Councilmember Allen, who chairs our Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, with an eye toward how we move forward with the rest of the recommendations. Again, I want to thank the commission, the co-chairs, Christy Lopez and Robert Bob, but the 18 other members for all the time that you put in, and also acknowledge the role of impact justice, because I don't think that without impact justice, but also without the 20 members, that we would have gotten to where we are today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chairman Mendelson. And I do want to reiterate again that thanks for all the commissioners who aren't on this Zoom screen with us, but who were incredible. And their work was, I will just never forget their hard work and their insights. It was a privilege to work alongside them. So we do have the Q&A open. Please submit questions through the Q&A. And Bethany will be fielding questions from there and deciding which of us should answer them.
Thank you, Christy. My name is Bethany Young. I've had the pleasure of serving as project manager for the commission with these 20 very hardworking, passionate, and energetic commissioners. So I'm going to kick us off, and I'm going to ask Commissioner Co-Chair Bob to answer the first question. The question is from Sam Collins. Beyond trimming the police force, in what ways can the recommendations be reflected in the budget? Also, what are the limitations of the commission in making these goals come to fruition?
The recommendations that the commission that we've made in our report, those recommendations will be forwarded by the chair to various committee chairs of the city council. We know that there are various committees, and in our report, there are recommendations that are focused on specific committees of the city council. So we report to the Judiciary Committee in our conversations with Councilmember Gray. There are reports particularly on the issues of the significant involvement of the Department of Behavioral Health, and that's under in Commissioner Gray's committee. And so we would expect that many of the recommendations that we're making will find its way at home to a city council committee. We don't expect that, and that those recommendations will be considered as part of the budget of the budget that's being the proposed budget process. We don't expect that all of our recommendations will be funded immediately, but we understand how the district budget process works, and that some of those recommendations will require multi-year funding. And so that's how we currently see our recommendations moving forward.
Thank you, Chair Bob. Or Christy, were you going to say something? Oh, sorry, I saw your mute come off. I'm going to ask Commissioner Davis to answer the next question. And Sam, if you could talk a little bit more about the differences in the youth perspectives you heard based on where in the city folks resided.
Sure. So I would say there hasn't been many differences. Young people, Black, brown, white, even all across the city have expressed the various harm and violence and fear that they experience when on the bus in their communities, going to school, coming home from school, in their schools. And so that was pretty consistent across the board. There was a young woman, Halisa, who did share with us her experience in going to BASIS, so a DC public charter school, and she was there for years, and how as the school got had more Black students come, she noticed more police presence, and shared of a story that many of us are probably familiar with a young boy saying that he was going to go shoot hoops after school, and how they shut down the schools and called in police presence, and said that that was a very different experience for her than previous years when the school was more predominantly white. And so we do see young people across the board acknowledge the harm and fear that police invoke in their communities, whether it's Ward 1 and immigrant young people who were selling chips in front of their schools and was targeted by police officers, or if it's young people in Ward 7 and Ward 8. That part is consistent, but there has been this acknowledgement that at the school level, it could look different depending on how many young people of color are there.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Commissioner Prince. He's the barking member in the background. I'm going to ask Commissioner Davis Sultan, to talk about recommendations around removing police from traffic enforcement and replacing them with DDOT. And then Commissioner Lopez to talk about recommendations around mental health for officers and training.
With respect to moving traffic enforcement over to the Department of Transportation, what needs to be done is to evaluate all of the different bases for pulling over a vehicle in the District of Columbia and assess which of those are appropriate for MPD to be involved in. Most likely, those should be the ones that involve an immediate threat to public safety. And then evaluate which of those do we not need to have at all because they're actually not promoting public safety, and the cost benefit analysis suggests that they should be repealed altogether. And which of those infractions need to be redefined so that they make more sense and are more carefully tailored to public safety, and which of those should be enforced by someone other than an armed policeman. So we hope that advocates will advance a list like that to the council, and that the council will carefully examine each of those different bases. But we have seen jurisdictions in Northern California already adopt this approach, and there's a report from the Justice Collaborative and Data for Progress that speaks to this kind of an initiative.
Yes, and I might add that that's one of those recommendations that the work on that recommendation can begin immediately. And so that's not a recommendation that can be, that's a futuristic recommendation. That is the work that Commissioner Sultan just explained. That work can begin immediately. You can bring that coalition together, begin that work, and then have a process in place by the time the budget of 2023, I believe. So that's one of those recommendations that we can start on immediately.
So I can talk to the training, the questions we've had about training, about what we recommend along those lines. We have an entire section 7, that focuses on training at MPD. We asked them to redouble their efforts to turn their training into a more collegiate guardian sort of approach. There's a theme in policing of training police officers to be guardians, not warriors. And MPD is moving in that direction, but it has a lot more work to do. And we really want them to get the support that they need to move in that direction, which includes support to hire more non-sworn staff to carry that out. And we recommend training that runs the gamut. Mostly it's just an entire shift in how you train and the values that you're training, but also there are specific programs. For example, de-escalation training. We think every officer, not just a few, should get 40 hours of training in crisis intervention, how to interact with persons in mental health crisis, even though we recommend that there be co-responder teams so that we have mental health workers directly responding. We know that there will be times when police officers will be there, and we want them all to be fully trained. In addition, we recommend active bystandership for law enforcement training. To, full disclosure, that is a program that I began at Georgetown, and I began it for reasons that are literally on trial as we speak. We have officers in this country who do not intervene when they should to prevent other officers from doing terrible things. And we know from the research that we can train officers to step in and prevent harm. And we are doing a disservice to our officers by not doing that. MPD has signed up for that training. We really want to encourage them to follow through with it, with the entire program. Lots of training programs along those same lines to really have a police department with a very different approach. I also run a program called Police for Tomorrow, and we have officers in there who are asking for this kind of training. We know that MPD officers want it and need it, so we're asking MPD to provide it. But the other question was about that thing. Was there something? Oh, officer wellness. Officer wellness has being a police officer is a difficult job, and officer wellness had not only the trauma of the work not only affects community members. But some of what officers see also impacts them. They can bring that home to their families, and of perhaps primary importance to the work of this commission, that can be meted back with inappropriate conduct to communities. So we know that helping officers stay mentally healthy has a broad impact on officers' families, and the community. And so we encourage MPD to redouble its efforts in that respect as well, and make sure that officers are getting the mental and emotional support that they need, that it's not stigmatized, that it's supported, and that it's celebrated, that officers need to be emotionally and psychically strong as much as they need to be physically strong, if not more so.
Yes, Bethany, I would like Commissioner Davis, if we may, to just pivot back to the schools and speak a little bit about the deficit that we see in the schools based on national research in terms of school counselors, and because it's not just about the police, it's about adding recommendations to the school district to provide more specialized services, to expand the services that they're providing. So I really want to make sure that important recommendation is not missed.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner Bob. So a part of the recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll try to have Prince calm down a little bit, is while we're talking about reducing or eliminating police, the investments are really also what's key here. And so we're adding those investments, knowing that I'm gonna move, don't mind me, this is just Zoom life. Knowing that for DC public schools, we currently have a ratio of 1 security guard for every 165 students. However, we have 1 social worker for every 254 students, 1 psychologist for every 529 students. And so what we know is that young people, again, need to have their social emotional wellness met. And right now, DC is falling behind in the majority of our schools in meeting the national standards of what's appropriate for the social worker to student ratio, the counselor to student ratio, as well as the psychologist to student ratio. However, we have more than enough security officers and police officers there. That looks different with predominantly Black schools versus predominantly white schools. And so that's one area. The other areas that we know to be true is the need for community-led safe passage supports, as well as violence interrupters in the schools. And so we're making recommendations to ensure that those investments are made as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. I'm going to ask Commissioner Sultan to talk about the report's recommendations that touch on immigration and immigrant communities.
I might ask Commissioner Goldston to jump in as well here. But one Commissioner Bob mentioned earlier has to do with the enforcement of immigration in our schools and on our school campuses. While we were in the process of doing our work, the council was already looking at its sanctuary values and passed legislation relating to the policing of immigrant communities in the district and the role of the department in its relationship with ICE. So we saw some changes that we believe to be positive changes and that were consistent with what with the conversations we had with people advocating for the rights of immigrant communities and supported that, but there were some changes that were already made. And then on the non-police alternatives to first response, I think is the other place worth mentioning. And I'll ask Commissioner Goldston to speak to that as well.
Yeah, in our conversations with the Allied call center, some of the questions that we asked them was the level and extent of their training in terms of dealing with a variety of different scenarios. And one of those scenarios is dealing with our immigrant community. And so our recommendations do speak to ensuring that the Allied call center is able to when receiving calls relating to the immigrant community, able to refer instead of to MPD, to refer to community-based organizations that can provide assistance in terms of responding to calls that relate to the immigrant community, particularly the Spanish-speaking community. We did hear from some members of the some folks that do organizing in the vendor community, working with vendors in wards 1 and 4, and have tried to be sensitive to some of the needs of creating a culture of peacemaking within the vendor community in particular, but also training community members to not call MPD, but to be able to have other systems in place in the communities to make peace and to just ensure the safety of our immigrant communities, particularly not only our Spanish-speaking communities, but also our Ethiopian communities. Those are two particular communities in particular that we heard a fair amount from.
Thank you, Pastor Goldston. I'm next going to ask Commissioner Lopez to address the following 2 questions. The first, the commission does call for MPD to shrink and for the requirement of a department of 3,000 officers to be taken out of the law. Did the commission determine whether there is an appropriate size for the department and how quick a process shrinking it would be? And Commissioner Lopez, if you could also talk about the provisions, the unfulfilled provisions of the NEAR Act that the report covers. And then after that, I'm going to ask Pastor Goldston if you could talk about how the report begins to address the police union's power and influence over transparency, accountability, and oversight.
Thanks so much, Bethany. So we have 2 recommendations that address that question about the number of officers. One is there's a law on the books in DC that was put in place in the middle of the last century by the federal overseers of the district, in which they required a minimum of 3,000 officers in the district at a time when the population of the district was actually higher. We think that it makes no sense and flies in the face of the way we do things now to base the number of police officers on some static number thought up by people in the last century. We need to figure out what we want police to do and then have the number of police necessary to do that. And having a law on the books that says you have to have a certain amount, just really cuts against that whole way of thinking. So we recommend that law be removed from the books. Secondly, we recommend that we did not take a divestment strategy here. And what I mean by that is we did not try to use budget reductions as a way to drive policy. What we did is we came up with the ideas for what we think public safety and policing should look like in the district. And then we have a recommendation that is about realigning and reducing the police department in light of that new role for MPD. So we don't have the exact number that that should be. We do think that there can be a reduction. We recommend that reduction be at the rate of attrition for the moment. And while that's happening, that there is an independent assessment that is conducted so that we can figure out how much the right number of police for their role in public safety. And that's the right way to be making these decisions, that we actually need to be evidence informed and to be knowing why we have the number of police we have. We also note that some of the people who work for MPD don't need to be sworn officers. They can be non-sworn people who are doing functions, in IT, in curriculum development, in communications, all sorts of things that you don't necessarily need to be a police officer to do those functions. So that's the way that we approached that. We tried to be very thoughtful about it and really think about what was right for the district. Oh, and the next one was the NEAR Act. On the NEAR Act, I think one of the biggest things that we saw missing from in terms of what needs to still be done, the NEAR Act required that there be a co-response model with mental health and police officers, so that when someone is in mental health crisis, the team that responds has both someone with policing expertise and someone with mental health expertise. That seems to have been done as a small pilot at some point, but has never really been fully adopted or implemented. So we recommend that that be done. And if it can't be done via the Department of Behavioral Health, that it be done through a community provider. And again, that's in addition to the 40 hours of crisis intervention training that every police officer should have. Mental health and policing have a very substantial overlap and nexus right now. And we want to, as I said at the very outset, the most important thing is to improve community services so that we don't have mental health crises. But to the extent that we continue to have some, hopefully fewer, we want there to be a variety of responses. One for when a mental health responder can handle the situation, and another for when you actually might need a police response.
Yes, I'd like to, before Pastor Goldston, there is a study that's the acting chief has been paneled by the Police Executive Research Forum. And part of that study, as we understand it, is to look at the organizational assessment of the Metropolitan Police Department, which can get to the issues that Professor Lopez mentioned with respect to their officers performing functions that can best be provided by civilians, which means that that officer then can be assigned to other duties, more police duties. So, we're heartened by the fact that there is an organizational assessment that is underway or soon to be underway, commissioned by the acting chief of police. And so our work can help to inform how that study proceeds.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Bob. I also want to say I'm encouraged by the leadership of the acting chief with respect to taking the mental health of officers seriously and taking training around mental health seriously as well, because what we've learned as a commission is that the 900 officers or so that are currently trained to go out in partnership with the Department of Behavioral Health out of like a 4,000 member officer force is just totally inadequate to be able to respond to some basic community needs when our communities are in crisis. And we've lost loved ones because officers have responded and haven't been able to and haven't relied on their training, and our community is still dealing with the impact of that trauma. And so it's really a both and. It's both looking at the possibility of a co-responder model, but then also we're as much as possible really emphasizing a community-based model. And there's a lot of friction and conversation across the commissioners around those different approaches, but we're trying to work together here and do the both and so we stand united around that. There was a question also regarding unions. Could that question be restated? What was that question?
Yes, the question is, can we talk about how the report addresses the DC Police Union's power and influence over transparency and accountability? Okay,
sure. So I did co-chair that committee with Attorney Nike Sullivan, and was grateful for her leadership on that issue. We did meet with Police Commission and we did meet with the police union, excuse me, and in so doing, one of the things that we learned was obviously the police union has a sizable influence on the ways that discipline is handled in the department, and so our big recommendation and push is for ending qualified immunity for officers because, as has been noted, as by Chairman Mendelson, there must be a balance between liberty and public safety. And unlike any other, in some ways, one of the arguments we heard was that the police officers want to be treated like every other profession. But what we understand is that not every other profession has the ability to take human liberty and to take a human life. And so in the interest of transparency, which builds public trust, one of the things that we want to see immediately is that any officer who has an outstanding investigation, that information be made public, and that officers be able to be held accountable for when they use their force in undue ways. I mean, we're right in the middle of the Officer Chauvin's trial, right? And we know why we're here. We're here because the community clamored over some 19,000 people call for change. And so we're here because of you. We're here because of the nearly 200 people that are on this call right now, and whoever else is watching. We know that you wanted to see substantive change, and that and to that end, every single officer, when they cross the line and violate human liberty, they must be held accountable, and they cannot be treated like a DPW worker. They can't be treated like somebody working for the Office of Employment Services. You know what I'm saying? They got to be treated as somebody who has the power to take human liberty, to take human life. And so it's just as simple as that for us. We certainly, respect and appreciate what the union provided, but we didn't find that particular aspect of what they were recommending to be in the interest of public safety.
Yes, and Pastor Galante, I think I want to make one comment. What I believe we learned is that if an officer has been involved in a situation, that the personnel record only goes back 3 years. And so one of our recommendations is that the record, the employment record, disciplinary record are maintained throughout an officer's career and not expunged after a 3-year period of time. So you can take a look back at the entire history of how that officer performed when he or she may have been involved in an incident.
Exactly. If I don't pay my T-Mobile bill, it stays on my credit report for 7 years, but an officer can unduly use force and it falls off in 3. So some things it's just as simple as that. Some things just need to be made public, and so that the community can have some trust and confidence that officers, like everybody else, will be held accountable.
Thank you, Pastor Goldston.
If I could jump in, I just want to add, because in the national debate, there's been some talk about the fact that police unions can bargain over their discipline. The legislation the council adopted last summer exempts or removes from the bargaining table discipline. So the police union in DC no longer can bargain over discipline.
Yes, and we recommend making that permanent. So we, for all the reasons that you and Pastor Delante just articulated. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, chairman. Thank you to the council and for everyone who attended today. We are out of time. Please do reach out to me, Bethany Young, or the team at Rise Public Strategies if you have further questions or would like to speak to commissioners in more depth. And with that, we thank you for your attention. We hope that you will take some time with the report. These commissioners spent a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears on it. And again, thank you for your engagement.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bethany, as always.